Today's episode of Filmmaker U is brought to you by our sponsors OWC. Go to owcdigital.com for all your filmmaking and computer needs. And it's also brought to you by our other sponsors, Age of A.I. Make sure to check out ageaa.com so that you can see how they can help you in your post-production needs. Hi, I'm Gordon Raquel from Filmmaker U. At Filmmaker U, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify your existing skill set. You can learn more at filmmakeru.com or, of course, follow us on Twitter at filmmaker_u. Every week, we interview a film professional to discuss their work, and this week I'm joined by Tony Kent, whose work includes documentaries such as Spirit Unforgettable, I Am Burt Reynolds, and Apple TV Plus's Sidney, just to name a few. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I guess my first question for you, you've dealt with a lot of documentaries, and your new one for Apple TV Plus was on Sidney Poitier. I'm wondering, was there something about Sidney that you didn't know that you learned in the process of making this doc?
There was definitely a lot I didn't know about him. I definitely knew of him as a giant movie star and director and everything, but just about his personal life, and I didn't know how integral he was to the civil rights movement in the 1960s. I didn't know that his directorial work, I didn't know that he did Stir Crazy, which was an amazing film.
Yeah.
There's tons just about his personal life, and his journey was amazing to learn about for sure.
Interesting. So how did you get involved with this film?
Well, one of the companies that produced it is a company that I've done a few documentaries with before, biographical documentaries like I Am Bruce Lee was a good one, and we've done some other ones like on Patrick Swayze, Burt Reynolds, like you mentioned. And when the CEO of the company mentioned to me that they've got this one on their radar, and this was before the pandemic, like a year before the pandemic, they were talking about it, and I'm like, yes. No matter when it is, just let me know, and I will absolutely do it. And that's before I even knew that Oprah was involved, and we were going to get this amazing cast. And it was, as soon as I heard about it, I was like, yes, please, let me somehow work on it.
I'm going to interrupt this interview for 1 second. We want to thank PixelView, one of our sponsors. They're a streaming solution for filmmakers. PixelView lets you stream your work to remote clients for easy collaboration, and it works with both on-set teams and post-production teams. With built-in video chat, you can discuss and make changes in real time and stream directly from your editing software. Or you can use the hardware encoder to stream from DaVinci Resolve or the camera on set. See the promo code and the link in the video description below. So how much, because, whenever I talk to documentary editors, there's sort of like, if they do cinema verite, there's like an absurd amount of footage. But this one's very much like interviews with archival footage and what have you. So like, what was the footage like coming in? Like, how much did you have? And how did you get down?
There was still a ton. Like the stuff that I've done with verite, usually there's loggers and people that still cut that stuff down before it comes to me. This time it was just me watching at least the first month or so, when production was still ramping up, and we were still like coming out of the lockdown of COVID and stuff. They're like, okay, well, we want you to start on this, but we don't have all the interviews yet, or even half of the interviews yet. So we've got all this archive for you to watch. And it was interviews from the 60s and 70s. And 80s, and radio interviews from the 50s, and then he's got 2 audiobooks that are hundreds of hours, and then also the main interview footage with Sidney where he's looking straight into the camera was something that Oprah did about 10 years ago called Masterclass, and that was like 12 hours of footage. So there was a lot. There's still a ton for me to look through, and then also just the films that I knew we were going to talk about at least that we were planned to talk about in the outline. I went ahead and watched those again as well, and pulled selects and stuff like that.
So when because like I've talked to some editors, and they insist on seeing all the footage of their show if they can, whereas others are like, no, give me selects. I don't want. Like, how do you prefer to work from a director?
If the schedule and budget allowed it, I'd love to watch everything, just because I want to see everything, but that rarely happens that you get a chance to watch everything. And I didn't get to watch, and by the end, I probably watched all the interviews of all the people that we interviewed, but I mostly used, I got selects from the director and the writer after they shot, and then we would transcribe it, and there'd be script. We use script sync and Avid, so
Hmm.
basically you just read through it as a transcript, and so you can pull out all the selects, and then there's sometimes you want to just, when you're really looking for something that you're trying to make something work, then you go and sit and watch the whole thing and see what the mood is like. But yeah, if it was up to me and they had the time to keep me on, I'd watch everything for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and like, so because you talk about script sync and using that, how do you like to build your cuts? Because, like, again, when I talk to doc editors, I'm always fascinated because some, place a bunch of stuff in the timeline, slowly whittle it down. Others pick a moment and start working on that and building it. So how do you like to approach your footage and something like this?
Well, it's usually dictated by what they've shot. Like a lot of projects I work on, they haven't shot everything by the time I start. So it's like you start with what you've got. We had a great biographer who did a biography on Sidney. His name is Am Burt Reynolds. We used him in the film. In the original cut, because his interview was probably the longest because he knew everything about Sidney. We basically used him as a guide track, almost like we laid out the whole film, and then we went back and replaced him with people that were closer to Sidney. So yeah, I guess we probably did it that. It depends on, it's always project dependent, but I think that's how we did it on this one. And then also there was certain things that we didn't get from the masterclass interview that they just didn't touch on that we wanted to touch on in this film. So that's where all the other archive that I watched, and that's where we filled in the blanks that way. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So now the other thing I always see with docs is your first cut's 12 hours or something crazy like that.
Yeah.
So, but there's always something that you have to get rid of that you really liked, but it just doesn't fit in the story or doesn't fit the structure. It's just too long. Is there something from the doc that you really liked but just didn't work with the film?
There's a couple things that, and it's not necessarily, well, like in my opinion, certain things would work, but it's not always the opinion of the directors or the producers. But yeah, there's a few scenes definitely. Well, the whole movie, it could have been 2 movies, or it could have been like a mini series. But
yeah,
so to get that down to, I think we ended up at like 140 minutes, maybe. I can't remember the exact runtime. I've watched it a million times now. So, but there was a film that he did called The Long Ships. I don't know if you've heard of it, but you should Google it out. Well, if you've heard of it, you've seen it. People should Google it and look at, watch the film, or just see the photos of Sidney in this giant pompadour wig as a so-called as a Viking. Is pretty amazing, and he kind of did that film as a favor to somebody, and that was not a film that he, at the end of his career, that he really looked back on with a lot of positive view. But then we had an interview late with one of his daughters, Sydney, with a Y, who was also an actress. I don't know if she's acting as much now, but she was in Death Proof with Quentin Tarantino.
Yeah.
And Quentin Tarantino is a huge movie nerd. So one of his favorite films is Long Ships. So they did a screening at Quentin Tarantino's house of Long Ships. And then Sydney says that kind of changed her father's view of the film because Quentin loved it so much. But yeah, people should check it out because it looks different from anything. People think of Sidney Poitier, they think suit and tie and in the heat of the, and this is like a crazy Viking movie on the sea. So that was one of the scenes. There's a few other ones, but that one was pretty funny that we ended up not being able to use for timing and for budget purposes and all that. But yeah, that was a fun one.
So you mentioned you've seen the film 140 times or more. So how do you maintain perspective as you're editing and not, because like you're watching, you're like, oh, I've seen this. It's going to become boring. But you also have to make sure that you're not overcutting in that sense, right? Because how do you maintain perspective?
Well, for me at least, I don't know how a lot of other editors work, but the first bunch of times I'm watching it, it's more at a micro level. I'm looking at certain edits, and I'm really listening to sound edits as well. So then once other people start watching it, it's such a, to me, it's the most important process. As uncomfortable as sometimes it can be, is to, and we couldn't do it with COVID, but we did it live streaming, but to sit in a room with other people and see how they react, feel how they react to stuff, that's, to me, that's the most important screening process. So that it takes away from the so-called monotony or boredom of watching the same cut over and over and over. But yes, I wouldn't want to sit and watch it a bunch more times, but it's absolutely necessary to do it. So it's part of the job.
Well, and it's, yeah, I just always find it interesting that you're going to watch it a million times and you still have to go back and watch it again.
Yeah, and it's trickier when it's a feature length documentary, too, like a 30-minute episode or something. Yeah, it takes up a good chunk of the day because you're watching a 2-hour cut and then you're talking about it for another 2 or 3 hours. So
now, really
have to space those out and not get super burnt out on it.
Is there a discussion in the cutting room about how people are going to be viewing this? Because I feel like if they're seeing it in the theater, there's a different sort of way of interacting with it. But now with, everything being on a streaming service, you might have someone sitting on a subway watching it on their phone. Are you guys taking that into account while you're cutting, like in terms of visuals and making sure people can see it?
That's a good question. I don't think that really came up as much. I think it had limited theatrical release, but we treated it as if it was a theatrical film. So, a few times that I saw it on a theater screen, it's definitely more engaging and well, it works both ways actually, because the interview with Sidney, where he's straight on, is you're so just into his world. So I could see it working on a phone just as well as it does on a massive theater. It's like we designed it in a way that his interview was the only one that was facing straight on, where all the interviewees were angled. So it feels like having a conversation with him. So yeah, I could see it actually working on a phone just as well as it does on the theater screen.
Yeah. Now, what would you say was one of the more challenging scenes for you to get to work? Because getting documentaries to work, you're bringing in stuff that don't necessarily relate to one another. Was there a particular scene that stands out for you?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. There was the scene of him winning the Oscar. We had so many different versions of that, and it's like, what do we want to focus on? And so yeah, that one went through a lot of iterations, and I think we ended up with the best balance of telling Sidney's story, but it was also Oprah telling her story of watching it, and Lenny Kravitz talking about being from the Bahamas. And yeah, there was a lot of scenes, like some of the scenes were very close to what we did in the first pass, and then others were multiple versions. And as it goes up the chain, director, producer, like everybody's everybody's got different ideas of what it should be, but that one was challenging because it was so important and we really had to nail it. So I'd probably say that one had the most versions of it.
Yeah. And what would you say is your most favorite, or your favorite scene from the film?
I really liked the Buck and the Preacher scene.
Why is that?
It's later, and it's kind of near the third, fourth act, and it's Sidney has just kind of received all this backlash about from his community about maybe being an Uncle Tom. So he's like not sure what his next path is going to be. He also had this huge fight with Harry Belafonte after the assassination of Martin Luther King. So they're lifelong friends, but they were on the outs there. And so he gets a call from Harry, and they're going to do this project together. And he's like, yeah. So they've got that reconciliation, but then also a week in, they realize that the director is not nailing the vision, because Harry and Sidney are producers on this as well.
Yeah.
So they've got that skin in the game. So they end up firing the director after a week, and they're like, oh, well, Sidney, can you take over just for a week or whatever? And but then the production company or I can't remember who it was, MGM or whoever, really liked what he was doing. So now, wow, he's the director of the film. So it's that pivot in his career, which is amazing. The reconciliation with Harry, and then the footage that we had, the behind the scene. They actually did a behind the scenes on that film.
Okay.
We see Sidney directing. We see Harry goofing around in the background, and so yeah, his first gig as a director and this pivot in his career, and the fact it was a Western was amazing. So much different from all of his other films. So, and it was kind of a turning point in our film as well. So yeah, I really enjoyed that one.
Now, you've done many biopics or many biography documentaries. You know, I Am Burt Reynolds, I Am Paul Walker. So how do you approach these? Because, you know, films tend to fall into structures. Like if we look at Marvel, it's basically the hero's journey, or, you know, there's a biopic structure. How do you respect the structures that you might work with in these different docs, but still create sort of a unique, engaging moment so that people aren't just sitting there going, oh, this is the same structure?
It's tough because a lot of times, like that's a big goal, is to what can we do to make this stand out a little bit, but also at the same time, the structure that works kind of works for a reason.
Yeah.
So it's like sometimes you try different things just for the sake of trying different things, and it's like, oh no, actually maybe it's better to start at the beginning. And so there's opportunities where you can mix things up, but a lot of times to follow the journey, you really need to start from the beginning and go along that way. So yeah, it's I guess it's an individual case in the film. Like sometimes it makes sense to move stuff up, and sometimes it doesn't. So it's instead of worrying about the structure or repeating, it's more just listening to what the film is telling you and just kind of what feels right, what feels the best.
Now, I have one last question for you. What would you say is your favorite guilty pleasure film or show to watch?
My favorite film to rewatch is probably Wet Hot American Summer.
Oh, that's great. What did you think of the TV show?
It was pretty funny.
Yeah.
It was cool to see them. And then there was also a documentary, like a behind the scenes making of the documentary.
Yeah.
Of the original film. So yeah, that's probably, and it's definitely a guilty pleasure because it's ridiculous, but yeah.
Yeah.
I would say that.
Yeah, it was a great series.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you so much for letting me interview you today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It was great to talk to you.
Thanks. And that's it for this week, everyone. Make sure to check us out at filmmakeru.com and, of course, on Twitter at filmmaker_u. I'm Gordon Burkell. Thanks for watching. Today's episode of Filmmaker U is brought to you by our sponsors, OWC. Go to owcdigital.com for all your filmmaking and computer needs. And it's also brought to you by our other sponsors, Age of A.I. Make sure to check out ageaa.com so that you can see how they can help you in your post-production needs.